All right. Good day, everybody. Welcome to this Cloud Lunch and Learn session with Abdul Kazi. He is going to talk about Azure landing zones and provide an overview of Azure landing zones today. I am posting a link in the chat for registration and survey. If you could go to that link, there will also be a QR code that Abdul is going to share in his slide deck here at the beginning and at the end. So please do that if you could. It's helpful for our sponsor, Microsoft, to understand attendance and get feedback on the presentations. So without further ado, I am going to go on mute and offline and off camera, and I'm going to turn things over to Abdul. Thank you very much, Abdul.
Thanks, Ryan. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. As Dwayne said, my name is Abdul Kazi. I'll be presenting today's session on Azure Landing Zone, and it's going to be mainly an overview. So before we jump into the session, here's, as Dwayne said, the slides for the registration. So if you guys want to note down the link is over here, the AKS MS. So I'll just give you a few seconds to jot that down. And then a brief introduction about myself. So my name is Abdul Kazi. I've been in the IT industry for almost 20 years now, 7+ years of experience with Azure. I work for a Microsoft Azure MSP partner up in Toronto, Canada. And I'm very active in the Azure community. I write blogs. And just to note, I've written a couple of blogs actually on Azure Cloud Adoption Framework and Azure Landing Zone. So do check them out. Today is going to be a brief session, but if you're looking for more details, just check my sessions out. Also, you can follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. So here's the agenda, what we're going to talk about. First, the cloud adoption motivators, why move to the cloud, the value of creating cloud-ready environment, meaning, why do you want to have a ready state before you move to the cloud. We'll kind of touch on the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. Then we'll talk about the Azure Landing Zone design areas. I'll briefly talk about Azure Blueprint. The funny thing about Azure Blueprint is it's been in preview for 2 years, actually more than 2 years now. But it really integrates with the landing zone. So I want to give that like a high level. And then we'll talk about Azure Policy. So that's the agenda for today. So let's get right into it. So first thing, why, adopt the cloud? So a lot of companies are moving into the cloud now. And when I talk to my customers, the enterprise customers, I mainly deal with enterprise customers, or even I'm talking to SMB or mid-market. Some of them already are in the cloud, and they at least have one workload in the cloud. One of the biggest motivation going to the cloud is they want to change the model. What I mean by that is, so think about from a traditional data center standpoint. When you're doing procurement, you're buying, your equipment, your servers, networking, switches, firewalls, what have you, on a capital expenditure. So you buy them outright, usually, and then you keep them for 3, 5, 7 years, depending on how you want to depreciate them and what the internal policy is. With the cloud, what's happening is it's moving to a capital expenditure. So think about cloud as a renting model. It's just like your utility bill. So you have your electricity, you consume it, and you pay. So that's the model. A lot of people are moving to the cloud because either they want to minimize their on-premise footprint, or they're looking to move to the cloud because they want to do DR, disaster recovery, or high availability in the cloud. Rather than building a second data center, they're like, it's more cost effective and doing it that way. Because the biggest thing about cloud is it gives you scalability, right? So let's say if you need a workload, you need to do some testing for only 6 months. If you go traditional route, you're spending that money, you have all that hardware, you do the testing, and now what happens? That really becomes a sunk cost for you. So when you're moving to the cloud, the good thing is after 6 months, you shut the equipment down, you delete everything, and it's done, right? You don't have to pay anything. There's no cost to it. So that's why there are a lot of motivators coming to the cloud. Security is becoming paramount now. So you get better security in the cloud than you can provide on-prem. So that's one of the main adoption motivators to moving to the cloud. Now let's talk about creating cloud-ready environment. So when you want to move to the cloud, you want to be ready. One of the challenges I've seen is people, when they move to the cloud or want to move to the cloud, is they bring their on-prem hat. What I mean by that is, they're bringing the same skill set from on-premise environment to the cloud. They're bringing the same architecture. They're bringing the same design, which sometimes it's not, ideal. And usually it's a mismatch because cloud is very different than on-prem environment. Things are not going to be the same as on-premises. Not from only the architecture complexity, it's very different, but from an operational standpoint, it's going to be very different. So you have to think how that's going to work. And then the biggest thing is lack of skill set. When you're moving to the cloud, complete different skill set. Perfect example of DevOps is huge now. There's so many tools with DevOps like Terraform, Chef, Puppet, what have you. That is required for the cloud. Yes, you can argue that there are other tools that you can be using on-prem similar to DevOps, but the point is there has to be a skill set change. So you have to be ready. The other biggest piece I've seen is compliancy, because when you're in your own environment, in your own data center, usually, the compliancy is easier. But when you're moving to the cloud, the thing is you might be in multiple regions. So for me, I'm in Canada. Canada has 2 regions, right? If I want to spin up another region in a different company, I have to look at the compliancy. Can I even have that data residing in another country? How's the compliancy going to work? So those are the factors that makes cloud a little bit more complicated, but you have to figure that out upfront. If you have an on-prem environment, or if you're in your own data center, or even if it's a co-location, because it's going to be within the geographical region, or even within the same country, compliancy is not going to be an issue. But if you are going to be spinning up a region in a totally different country, then yeah, compliance is going to be an issue. So those are the things that have to be accounted for when you are moving to the cloud or when you're transitioning to the cloud. So those pieces are absolutely imperative, because some companies, they're highly regulated. So maybe they have SOC, they have PCI compliance, there's HIPAA, what have you. They have to abide. And then with Europe, for example, GDPR is a big compliance. So sometimes companies in Europe have to keep the data there. So that's why cloud becomes a little bit complicated, but you have to do your due diligence and make sure those things are covered before you make the transition. So I briefly mentioned the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. Not sure how many of you guys have heard of this, but this basically came from Microsoft Consulting Services. So what Microsoft used to do is they used this framework for their Microsoft Consulting Services for projects. And then a couple of years ago, they made this public for everybody to go and adopt this framework. So this is a phenomenal framework. And as you can see, the circle is keeps moving, meaning it's an iterative process. So there are main three facets to it: people, process, and technology. And cloud is ever evolving. People think, oh, we moved to the cloud, now our job is done. No, cloud is ever evolving, because think about it, cloud keeps changing at a faster pace. You might have one workload in the cloud. You might be getting more workload in the cloud. So it's going to keep changing from a operational standpoint, from a governance standpoint. There's so many facets to it. But in a nutshell, the cloud adoption framework brings people, process, and technology together to align business strategy. At the end of the day, whatever you're trying to achieve from a business aspect or business goal, that's what cloud adoption framework gives you. It from a actionable, efficient, comprehensive guidance. So make sure that you know how to plan properly when you're moving to the cloud. And so now let's talk about the different phases of the cloud adoption framework. So there are 6 phases of the cloud adoption framework. So the first phase is strategy, right? So in the strategy phase, you're going to define the business justification and expected outcomes, meaning you're going to define why do you want to move to the cloud. You have to go to management, especially the financial people. They're going to be very interested. Okay, what's the ROI for us to moving to the cloud? So that's really the strategy, defining the business justification and objective, and saying, okay, yep, this is a strategy for us to move to the cloud. The second facet of the cloud adoption framework is the plan. Create an aligned actionable adoption plan. So there has to be a plan how you are going to be moving to the cloud. The third state is ready. And this is actually where the Azure landing zone comes into play. So the ready state is, preparing the cloud environment for the planned changes. So whatever you planned in the second stage, ready is going to be basically preparing for that. The next one is going to be your adoption. And adoption actually comes into 2 ways. So you can do a migration. So think of it as a lift and shift. So you're taking your on-prem environment and just moving them as is, or you can, more innovate or modernize, if you will. So you can refactor, rehost, those kind of things. Because some applications might not be able to move to the cloud, or you might say, I want to make it much more efficient. So I want to move them to, let's say, PaaS, platform as a service. So you'll have to refactor, you'll have to make some adjustments to move to the cloud. Because then sometimes you have to develop the new native, cloud native solution, right? If you're doing a hybrid solution, generally speaking, it's more along the lines of infrastructure as a service. So depending on what route you want to go with, but that's really the main adopt phase. Then comes the govern phase. So governance, is as important as it's in the cloud, in on-prem. And I think, to me, governance, I would say, is the most important phase of the cloud adoption framework. And the reason being is, if you do not have governance from the get-go, you are going to struggle. So I'll give you an example. If you do not have, like, when I've seen people move to the cloud and they don't have any guardrails. What I mean by that is, anybody can spin up any workloads. There's no policies, there's nothing. And then what happens is people are spinning up, n-level virtual machines, for GPUs, those are expensive. And at the end of the day, you get bills and you're like, oh my God, what happened? So you need governance to make sure only approved workloads are being provisioned. The other thing is governance also comes into there's compliancy, and we'll talk. I'll touch a little bit on governance, but that's another complete session. But governance to me is very important because I've seen again and again people do not put enough emphasis on governance. Because thing is, if you think from the cloud adoption framework, yeah, you're going to define the strategy. That's a no-brainer. You have to have a plan to move there. You have to have a ready state, because if you are not putting the foundation for Azure, you won't be able to move there. And then adoption or adopt is okay. How do we want to migrate? But people tend to not put a lot of emphasis on governance because, yeah, we'll do governance once we move there, but you need to really have a handle of governance from the get-go. And the last piece is manage. So manage is, think about from an operational standpoint, right? Like conduct operation management for the cloud and hybrid solution. Meaning, how are you going to do patch management? How are the backups going to be done? Is it going to be in line with your on-prem environment? If you're going with a hybrid solution, those kind of things. Who's going to be managing? Obviously, you will probably be defined a RACI beforehand, so job duties. But from a management and operational standpoint, those things have to be figured out as well. So now let's jump into Azure Landing Zone and why Landing Zone is important. So think about Landing Zone as building a house or a building. Whenever you're building a house, you lay down the foundation, and the foundation has to be very strong. So Azure Landing Zone, it's really setting up the foundation. So for scalability, for security, governance, networking, and identity. Those are really the main pieces of the Azure Landing Zone. And then one of the things I've noticed is a lot of people think, okay, I'm really small, mom and pop shop. I don't need to set these things up. You want to, Landing Zone really does not apply only to enterprise customers, or if you only have a enterprise agreement. So Microsoft offers a lot of different vehicles or ways that you can buy the Azure subscription. You can have a enterprise agreement. You can have a MCA, Microsoft Customer Agreement. You can have a CSP, Cloud Service Provider Agreement. You can do pay-as-you-go. There's so many out there, but regardless which route you go, you definitely want to look at the Azure Landing Zone and set up the environment properly, because then if you don't plan, you're going to run into issues. Because thing is, you might start small. So the other question I get is, okay, I'm starting small. Do I really need to look at all of these facets? Absolutely. And we'll talk about in different sections about it. But, a quick example is from a networking standpoint. If you do not properly plan for the IPs upfront, you're going to have issues, because let's say if you pick a small CIDR / let's say 24 rather than /16, then that's going to be challenging, because you would have to go back and change your IP scheme networking. That's probably going to be some downtime. That's going to be causing a lot of changes in the design and architecture. So those are things going to play. So you definitely want to make sure that those things are accounted for, and you're already planning ahead of that, because cloud is going to grow, right? Your workload is going to grow. Now you might have 6 months, 12 months out, you might have a couple of workloads. So you have to keep thinking from a scalability standpoint. And that's the whole idea of moving to the cloud. So how do we get started? So this is really, the foundational level. There are many ways how you can implement the Azure Landing Zone. you can do it through Azure Blueprint. You can do Terraform. There's Terraform modules. For us, like and other companies I've seen, usually they're doing it through Terraform because it's all automated. You want to automate this as much as possible. Again, the challenge with Blueprint is it's not GA, so people don't want to basically go that route. There's no support, there's no SLA. Hopefully, when that becomes GA, that would be phenomenal. But yeah, these are the options. And Terraform does an amazing job of doing this. There are other tools as well you can use, like there's Biceps and other ways of automating as well. But Microsoft actually makes it easier for with the Terraform module to make this very automated. So now let's talk about the Azure Landing Zone design areas. What are the design areas? These are all the design areas, the enterprise enrollment. So if you are making a commitment to Azure, then you'll have a enterprise agreement. So enterprise enrollment is mainly for enterprise customers, or if you're a big customer. But you don't really have to be an enterprise customer to set up the Azure Landing Zone, as I mentioned. What happens is the first time you're going to set up Azure, you're going to be setting up your Azure AD tenant, and you're going to start building on that. The second piece is identity, and identity is going to be really interesting in a sense that it can get complicated depending how you were to do it. So let's say if you are going to be born in the cloud or just starting in the cloud, then you'll probably have a cloud only identity. So that might be easy. But if you already have an on-prem environment and you're going to go the hybrid route, you would already have an Active Directory on premises. Then you are going to be connecting your Active Directory into Azure AD through AD Connect, syncing that up. So that has to be planned properly, how the identity is going to be working. Do you want to do ADFS through that, or MFA has to be enabled? So there are different things that would come into play. Then resource organization, that's actually important because that's how you would figure out governance piece actually. So that's going to be very important as well. From a management standpoint, from the subscriptions, the resource group and the resources. So, and we'll talk about that in the couple of slides. Network topology and connectivity. As I mentioned, networking is very important. So that's going to be another design area you want to start looking from the get-go. Business continuity and disaster recovery, those are the things you have to plan. It's saying, okay, for example, in Canada, there are two regions. So Canada East and Canada Central. So the Canada Central region, which is is Quebec City, does not offer availability zones. So that's another thing, because availability zone is mainly for high availability. Now, then you have to plan, okay, what are we going to do about that? Do we want to have our workload in another region, for high availability? So those are things you have to account from when you're planning the environment. Governance discipline, as I mentioned, governance is very important. So from a compliance standpoint, your deployment options, I kind of briefly touched that. Terraform could be an option depending on how you want to do it. Now, everybody I'm seeing is going more automated. People are not yet usually deploying things through the portal. It's more automated. It's much faster. It is much cleaner. It's much easier even to manage, and it's well documented. So that's one of the ways I'm seeing things go now. And then operational baseline. So that has to be defined as well. how that's going to work, because operationally compliance, backup, protection, recovery process, that has to be defined as well. And these topics are so big that I can actually do a session in each of them. But what I'll do is I'll briefly touch on some of them today. So you might be asking, okay, do I really need all of these design areas, right? And the question is, depends. If you're really a small environment and you know that the workloads are not really going to be growing massively and it's not going to be a huge environment, start small. So these are your RBAC, networking, naming and tagging, and actually I'll add policy as well here. Those are going to be the must. You have to have those because those are the bare minimum, right? Like RBAC, role-based access control, you need that. You do not want to start giving out people owner permissions or contributor permissions, because that's going to cause havoc, right? Like it's the same thing that we do on-prem, the least privilege. So that's one of the things. Networking, as I mentioned, you need to decide about networking, how that's going to go. Naming and tagging is going to be important, and we'll see why that's going to be very important. But then as you become bigger, security operations, and then that's going to be also becoming more prevalent. So if you're a larger environment, from the get-go, governance might play a big role, depending on the teams. If you have a decentralized teams, where each team is going to be managing their own line of business, governance is going to come into play right away. And security is going to come into right away. So if a team is managing their own line of business and the line of business is separated out through a management group, then you need to have those things into play. But if it's a very centralized organization where IT is managing everything from the root management group down, then it's going to be easier from a security governance standpoint, but you still have to have those things in place. So I kind of briefly mentioned about RBAC. So role-based access control, it's really, providing access to the Azure environment. And there are three main facets to it. So there's going to be, the principal, the security principal, the role that you assign, and then the scope, right? So from a security principal aspect, there are four objects, if you will. So user, groups, service principal, and managed identity. So user is going to be an individual user. Group is going to be a group. You have the service principal, and then the managed identity. So managed identity is really, when you want to assign a user to, let's say, like automatically, actually, managed identity is automatically managed by Active Directory, it's managed by Azure automatically. So it's like a managed service through Azure. So depending on what service are you doing, you want to basically, based on that, you can check. And then on the role side, there are different roles. So role definition, you have the owner, contributor, and reader roles. So those are basically built-in roles. I do not recommend you define assigning anybody owner or contributor role, because that's too much access for them. And then what you want to do is assign custom roles. So one of the challenges with custom role is it's not available right off the bat. So to create custom roles, you would need Azure AD Premium Plan 1 or Plan 2 licenses. Azure has a lot of built-in roles, but if you want to start building custom roles, then you would need to buy those licenses. And then the last thing is the scope. So where is the RBAC going to be assigned? Is it going to be assigned on the management group level, subscription, resource group, or even the resources level, right? Like the VMs, the databases, or what have you. So that's how you want to define that. And then this is a good way of defining how RBAC and tagging really work. So, you would break it down and say, okay, yeah, we need to have a customer, you have an environment, then you would create a role with appropriate permissioning, and then you would define the tags. So tagging is done you can do it on the resource level, resource group level. And then the tags are going to be assigned on the resources itself. So let's talk about tagging for a second. What exactly is tagging? So tagging is, it's really leveraged to logically group and track Azure resources. And then if you are managing tagging because you might be automating your deployment, or you want to provide visibility on recurring costs. So the perfect example is, let's say if you're doing a chargeback to an internal department, right? With tagging, what you can do is you can tag all those resources, and then you can do a chargeback. So it makes it easier for you to do chargeback. If you don't have tagging, you'll have to go into each and every resource, figure out, okay, which resource belongs to which department, and that's definitely going to become a lot of challenge. So yeah, tagging is very important, and these are the main classifications of tagging. So you need to define, okay, tagging, from a tagging standpoint, is it going to be functional? What are the classifications of tagging? So classification could be even data classification, where you can say, okay, this is a public data, this is a private data, this is a confidential data, this is critically high data. So you can even do tagging from that aspect, and then define the purpose of tagging. Like tagging could be for a project, could be for internal accounting purposes. So there are many ways you can use tagging, but from the get-go, all resources, when they are provisioned, should have tagging, and you should have policies, and we'll talk about policies at the end. But when you are spinning up or provisioning any resources, there should be a policy that it should tag those resources to make it easier to manage the environment. Also, keep in mind there are limitations to tagging. Like, for example, the maximum number of characters for tag name is 512, and then the storage accounts have a limit of 128 characters. So keep them in mind. And one of the biggest challenges is there's no inheritance hierarchy for tags. So that becomes a challenge, because for example, RBAC, right? RBAC, it goes down. There is inheritance. So, but there's no inheritance for tagging. So keep that in mind. I've seen people where they thought there was inheritance, but it doesn't work that way. So just keep that in mind, and for the tagging. The other thing is, from a tagging standpoint, there are tags that you cannot use. So for example, Azure, Windows, and Microsoft are reserved and cannot be used as a tagging prefix. So those names cannot be used. So now let's talk about networking. As I mentioned, networking is very important, and as you can see here, this decision guide actually makes it easier to start deciding what you want to plan moving into Azure. So for example, IP address planning is vital first step when designing a network in Azure, especially if you have a hybrid environment. To avoid overlapping IP addresses across on-premise environment in Azure, right? Because you cannot have the same IP in your on-prem environment and in Azure. That's going to be a conflict. So that's going to be a challenge. So depending on your environment, you want to figure out, okay, what is the workload going to look like? So if you say, okay, do I really need a virtual network? And you say no, okay, then you're moving to PaaS only services. If you say yes, I need virtual network, then the next step is going to be, okay, so do I need on-premise connectivity? If you say yes, then you need to figure out, okay, what kind of connectivity am I looking for, right? If you're a small environment, you can probably get away with site-to-site VPN. But if you're enterprise customer, then ExpressRoute might be the way to go. And then it also, you have to figure out, okay, what exactly am I looking from an ExpressRoute standpoint? Because ExpressRoute, comes, and even with VPN gateway, that comes in different flavors, different SKUs. So you want to choose the right SKU. So for example, I personally don't like using the basic VPN gateway SKU because it has limitations. I usually go with GDW1 because it's the next level. It's not that pricey, but it gives you much more features, right? So know the limitations upfront and then how you want to do it. With the ExpressRoute, the multiple SKUs. One thing I would recommend is have multiple connections. So let's say if you're going the express route, and if you do not want to have two express route, because having one is going to be a single point of failure. So what you can do is have an express route, and then as a backup, just use a VPN gateway or site-to-site VPN, right? As a fallback. So at least you have something. So those are the things you have to keep in mind when you're doing the planning. The next thing is, are you going to be using Azure Firewall, or are you going to be bringing your own firewall? The NVAs. I've seen a lot of enterprise customers bringing their own firewall because they already have that in their on-premise environment, and they are familiar with it. They have the licenses. It's not going to be extra cost to them. So that's going to be another piece, right? Like how that's going to look like, that's going to be another defining factor from a networking standpoint, because that's going to change the architecture. There's going to be a lot of things that have to be worked out. From an application standpoint, if you're going to be hosting an app, you probably want to set up a WAF, web application firewall. Like if you have Azure web apps, then yeah, WAF is going to be there. So how's that going to work? And then if you have your NVA firewall, third-party NVA firewall, how's that going to interact with WAF? Is that going to be bypassed, or all traffic is going to go through the third-party firewall? Like those are the decisions you have to make, right? So those are the things that have to be design factors. And then from a design consideration, Azure reserves the 5 IP addresses which each subnet. So factor in the sizing in there. The sizing is very important. So and make sure that you're aware that some of the Azure services require separate subnets. So for example, your application gateway, your web application firewall, Azure Bastion, and VPN gateway, they require their dedicated subnet. So make sure that you account for those when you're planning. And then DNS is very important, right? Like in December, one of the major public cloud providers had a downtime because of DNS issues. So DNS is critical. So if you already have an existing DNS, you can use those, but those servers. But if you don't have any DNS, or if you want to bring or use any DNS services in Azure, I would recommend using Azure DNS services. So that's going to be very critical from that aspect. Now, factors that influence the right setup, right? Why do you want to do this? So the cost, transparency, because as I mentioned, if you don't have governance, anybody can start spinning up services. Azure has more than 300 services, right? So you want to make sure that you have the proper guardrails that are set up there. The other thing that actually just popped up in my mind is, I don't know if most of you guys know, but Troy Hunt, he's Aussie. He wrote a blog post last month. He got hit with the Azure bill, I think of if I'm not mistaken, $11,000. So you have to make sure that things are done properly. Roles and responsibility from the get-go. Make sure the roles and responsibilities are defined. You have a RACI that people know, okay, what are they accounted for? What are they responsible for? And then from a compliancy standpoint, make sure that compliancy is there. So that's going to be important. I already kind of mentioned the GDPR as a compliancy example. So that's going to be one of the things that you have to look into as well. So how do you organize your resources? So these are the main 3-4 pillars, if you will, of the management or organizing your resources. So the first is the management group, which is the highest level. So when you have a tenant, you'll have a root management group. Then underneath that, you'll have a subscription, resource groups, and then resources, right? So resources are mainly your virtual machines, your VNets, your SQL Server, what have you. So those are the main resources. And then you really want to make sure that they are consistent across the board, because you would be assigning policies to management groups, subscriptions, resources. So that actually kind of makes it much more easier if everything is assigned, is consistent across the board, and make it easy there, right? So from a subscription aspect, let's talk about subscription, and I'll come back to the management group in a minute. But from a subscription design aspect, there are multiple ways how you can really design your subscription. So in this example, they're dividing their subscription into development subscription, lab subscription, QA, and production. And it really depends on the structure of the organization, how your organization is going to be. If you can even do it through line of business. So if you have a line of business, yeah, you can have a subscription just based on line of business. It really depends on the organization, how the structure of the organization is, because that's going to make a huge difference. And then keep in mind, you're not going to have just one subscription there, right? There are limitations, there are quotas on subscription. So be aware of the quotas and limitations of subscription. Usually landing zone, I've seen like multiple subscriptions because, and you can have a handful of subscriptions. Like you can have anywhere from, I would say, half dozen subscriptions to 2 dozen, but I would not go that far because it can get complicated very quickly. And depending on the structure, you want to keep it as simple as possible. But yeah, define why do you want to have multiple subscriptions, what are the critical workloads going to be, and then that's going to be the main thing, because is going to be assigned to the subscriptions. You can assign policies to subscription, so that's going to be very critical. And organize subscriptions, right? So as I mentioned, subscriptions, because there are limitations, you want to also define how they're going to be defined depending on separation of duties. If it's a test or dev environment, different end customers. I've seen, for example, if it's an ISV, they might even have a complete different subscription for their end customers. Some business units do subscription just based on the project. So it really depends on what the need is and the use case is. And basically, you want to do it that way. So now let's talk about management group. As I mentioned, the top one is the root management group, right? And then underneath, what you can do is you can split it out. What I've generally seen is usually people divide it into corporate groups or the enterprise. Then you can do it under line of business. You can even do core services too. So break it down into core services where for example, your networking. So if you have a hub and spoke model, your hub and spoke would be coming under the core services. And if you want to go down even, you can even have a management group for networking, and another management group for security. I don't recommend because it can get complicated depending on the environment, but yeah, you can do that. Keep in mind, management group, you can go up to 3 or 4 layers. I don't recommend going that deep, but if the need is there, by all means. But divide the management groups accordingly, that it makes sense for you to make sure that whatever the management group is, it really makes sense. And then obviously the subscription. So let's say if you have a production management group, then your subscriptions are going to be dependent or based on that, right? You're going to define your subscriptions based on that. So if it's a production management group, you'll say, okay, mission critical, you have the protected data, and then other production workloads here. If it's development, then non-production, test dev, UAT, those kind of things. And then I've also seen people, they have a complete separate tenant for testing environment. But those are larger organization where they're replicating their production environment into a separate tenant for testing purposes. They do not want to do any testing there. So it really depends on how the production environment is laid out, and then you can go how you want to do this. So this is the governance MVP consideration. Management hierarchy could be based on business unit, geography, could be environment. Subscriptions could be per application, per production. It could be even dev environment, production. So in this example, right, it's divided into geographical region. So let's say this is, one could be in Canada, the other one could be in the US. And based on that, the environments are divided. So again, really depends on the use case you have, and then you can go from there. So now let's move on to the Azure Blueprint, and I'm going to actually run fairly quickly with the blueprints because it's still in preview. But Azure Blueprint really is really a package. Think of it as a package of creating specific sets of standards and requirements that governs the implementation of Azure Services Security and Design. What that means is, in a nutshell, is it's a repeatable process. So once you have the blueprints, you can start deploying the artifacts at a scale. So it makes it easier. And we've already kind of talked about these, right? The role-based access control, the policy, we'll talk about policies in a minute. And then the ARM templates are going to be there, the resource group. So these what really makes the Azure Blueprint artifacts, and then the Azure Blueprint really manages, and then you deploy it at scale. So that's a good product. Hopefully Microsoft brings this out to GA soon. So now quickly on the first landing zone. So from a complexity and compliancy standpoint, so if you look at this, it's easier, or actually it's less complex from a policy standpoint, from an identity storage standpoint. Networking and data are going to be more challenging, or it can get complicated depending on the environment. So, you have to factor there. Policy from a compliancy is going to be high. Data can be less compliant, depending on what the requirements are. So factor this in. This is a great chart to factor in and see, okay, how this is going to work, and how what the requirements are basically. So expanding on the landing zone, these are the three main categories: hosting, Azure fundamentals, and governance. So hosting is, the decision is across how the compute, storage, networking, databases are going to be created. And those are the main pillars, right? Like compute, storage, networking. Those are the main pillars of when you're setting up the Azure environment, regardless if it's landing zone or not. Then the Azure fundamentals, and we'll talk about the fundamentals in a second in the next slide. And then governance consideration. I've already talked about different governance considerations and principles. So those should be the factors. And then from a recommendation standpoint, these are the fundamentals. So, Azure fundamentals, networking, identity and access control, storage, database, and cost management. These are critical for going into Azure, because all of these are going to affect you if you do not plan properly. So, cost management. What I'm seeing now is people are already in the cloud. They want to optimize their costs. So they're thinking, okay, what's the best way of optimizing our costs? So that really comes under cost management. There are multiple ways of doing it, right? So these are things that would be evolving as you go. And as I've mentioned, cloud is ever evolving. So these things never stop. Governance is never going to stop. Your operations is not going to stop. So keep these best practices going, regardless if you're just getting into Azure or if you're already there and been in Azure for multiple years. And then lastly, we'll talk about Azure Policy. So before I jump into explaining why Azure Policy, let's talk about what Azure Policy is. So Azure Policy is used to create, assign, and manage policies, which helps you to enforce compliancy and enabling auditing for Azure environment. So basically what happens is, I'll give you a perfect example. As I mentioned, if you have a compliance requirement to keep data in a specific region or a country, um, what you can do from an Azure policy standpoint is you can really limit where the new resources can be provisioned. So, for example, if I want to limit, okay, any new resources should only be provisioned or spin up in the Canada region, Canada East and Canada Central, I can have that Azure policy, and enforce that policy. So that's where policies really come into play. Um, their Azure policies actually can be implemented at various scope levels. So it can be implemented at a management group, subscription, resource group, and even at a individual resource level. Um, and then Azure policies, they have three different building blocks. So the policy definitions, policy initiative, and then lastly, the policy assignments. So you will define the policy. You will say, okay, how the policy is going to be implemented, and then where is this going to be implemented, right? So those are the main things from a policy standpoint. And then there's let's talk about the scenario. So the Azure policy use cases enforce a required tag. So as I mentioned, anytime you're provisioning a new resource, a tag should be assigned. So that should be enforced by policy. Only allowing resources type to be provisioned in the approved region, as I mentioned. So that's going to be another use case. Limiting the SKUs type. So you want to limit the SKUs for virtual machines, for example, right? To not only control cost, but from an operational standpoint, because you don't want just people spinning up all different kind of VMs. So from a Azure policy standpoint, that makes it easier to enforce that policy as well. And lastly, best practices, right? So what I'd say, first thing is start small. What you should do is never start with the deny, because that you're going to run into a lot of issues. So start in auditing mode. That's the best way of doing Azure policies. Start auditing all the policies, and then take each policy and then see what the effect is going to be, and then start enforcing and denying. Because if you start denying things right off the bat, that's going to be our biggest challenge, especially if you're going automation. So if you're doing automation, for example, Terraform, you don't want to start denying anything, because that's going to be, I've seen a lot of challenges with that, because the code, it's going to affect the code. So you want to be careful how you work with policies and how policies are going to be implemented. And with that said, we are at the end of our presentation. And again, if you haven't done the survey, or if you joined late, please take a moment to fill out the survey. This is needed for Microsoft from a sponsorship standpoint. Wayne,
Great.
back to you.
All right. Thank you, Abdul. Great presentation. Love talking about the cloud adoption framework. I've actually been doing some workshops myself this week for my company on the exact same thing. I was talking about landing zones yesterday. So
Nice.
Very, very nice presentation, very helpful, and very important for planning your cloud adoption. So thanks, Abdul, and thanks everybody who attended. Until next time, thanks everybody for attending this Cloud Lunch and Learn session. Have a great day.